I never set out to be a war photographer. I grew up in Connecticut in the US in a family of 4 sisters, and my parents are hairdressers. My dad came out of the closet when I was 8 years old. I was surrounded by transvestites, and suddenly it happened. Oh, I intentionally did that, actually.
Oh, sorry.
No, I'm joking. When I was 26 years old, I moved to India to try and make it as a photographer overseas. And I was living there and renting a room from the Dow Jones bureau chief, and I was quite poor. And he was working, like so many journalists, in Afghanistan at the time. It was under the Taliban, and the Taliban was actually inviting journalists in to show that they had brought stability to the country. Photography was illegal. It was only possible to photograph inanimate objects. But my roommate came home from a trip to Afghanistan, and he said to me, you know, you're a woman, and you should go to Afghanistan and photograph how women live under the Taliban, because there are so few women working there. So I didn't think twice. I called my sister, borrowed money, called my mother, said, Mom, I'm going to Afghanistan tomorrow, and she said, okay, honey, have a good time. And so I went. And I realized very quickly that I had access that my male colleagues didn't have. I was able to photograph women at home. The only women I saw on the streets at that time were beggars, mostly widows who did not have men to provide for them. Under the Taliban, women could not work. I went into the women's hospitals and photographed this as a woman giving birth under the Taliban. There were very few doctors, almost no medicine. The conditions were horrendous. And eventually September 11th happened, and I had already moved to Mexico City from India, but had traveled to Afghanistan 3 times under the Taliban. And I turned around and went right back to the region and covered the fall of the Taliban in Kandahar in 2001. In 2003, it was very clear that we were going to war in Iraq, and I wanted to be there. I wanted to be on the front lines of history. But I had no idea how to cover a real war. I had gone to Afghanistan when the Taliban fell, but there was no combat. So I was in South Korea on assignment for the New York Times Magazine, and I got an email from my editor at Corbis at the time. And he was asking me to buy body armor, helmet, flak jacket, and I had no idea what I was doing. So I'll just read you an email that I sent to my editor. Scott, I'm trying to buy body armor for my impending departure to Iraq, and I'm starting to break out in hives. I called AKE War Outfitters like you suggested, and they put me on hold for 3 minutes, knowing I was calling from Korea. I hung up. I then checked out the websites you recommended, and I'm not sure if I just tried to read Korean. Basically, I have no idea what I'm looking for. Ballistic, 6-point adjustable, tactical armor, etc. Please understand that this language is not familiar to me. I grew up in Connecticut and was raised by hairdressers. Would it be possible for you to call Second Chance in the States and explain to them that I am a photographer, I'm going to either Baghdad with the US troops or into northern Iraq with God knows which terrorists and tribal leaders. I am not as worried about bullets as I am about shrapnel, and I don't want anything too heavy, which I guess would mean ceramic plates. And I don't want to spend $1 million, though my life may be worth a fraction of that one day. And these are my measurements. I'm sorry if this is too much information for you, but I photographed for 13 hours today. It's 1:30 a.m., and I just want to get this planning over with. I'm 5'1", I have no idea what the circumference of my head is for helmet size, and I certainly have never measured the distance between my nipples. I would go downstairs and ask someone at the hotel for a measuring tape, but I don't think the people at reception would send me anything to measure my head at 1:30 a.m., because it would take them 3 hours with a Korean English dictionary to figure out what the hell I'm asking for. And I would surely jump out my window before going through that process right now. So let's just say I have a medium head. And as for my vest, my waist is 29 inches, my chest is 34, and I have big boobs. So I went to northern Iraq with many journalists, and I spent about 2 months there waiting for the fall of Saddam Hussein. And he did fall, and there was an initial period of euphoria. But very quickly, the horrors of war became unveiled, and we saw mass graves being unearthed, and what you're looking at are bodies. Each one of those white sheets is a body, and people would come and try and find their loved ones. Many Shiites were massacred under Saddam. And it turned into mayhem. There was no water, very little electricity in Baghdad. Everything was being looted. these are women online for a propane distribution, trying to cook for their families, and there was no propane. So the American troops, worried that people were getting very frustrated and anxious, started gassing them with this green gas. And I was sort of shocked as a journalist, thinking, aren't we here to bring them peace and happiness? There were fires across the country. This is in Basra, and it was a fire at a factory, and this woman was going to look for her husband, and there was liquid propane all around, and there were secondary explosions, and she just walked directly towards the factory. I went on night raids with the troops and saw them going into very hostile areas, and often as a journalist, they didn't tell us very much. They just said, we're going to find insurgents. They didn't try to stop us. We were with them. So long as we did not interfere, we watched them zip tie and put bags over people's heads. And in November of 2004, I got a call from Life magazine in America. And they said, we have this great assignment for you, and it's to photograph the wounded American soldiers coming out of the siege of Fallujah. It was the bloodiest battle that the US had seen since we entered Iraq. I had never seen wounded soldiers. In 2 years of covering Iraq, I had never had access to them because the American government didn't let us have access to them. So I was pretty shocked when I arrived and I actually could see wounded. They were completely open with us. I was able to photograph. The only stipulation was that I had to get a signed consent form from every troop that I photographed his face visible. This is the interior of a C-17 cargo plane. There were so many wounded coming out of battle that they stripped the entire inside of the plane and put the wounded on the floor of the plane and flew them to Germany for treatment. This is a young man who stepped on an IED, and this is how he was flown to Germany. So I spent 4 days on the ground, flew to Germany with them, and flew back to America. I sent the images to Life magazine. I sent dozens and dozens of images of wounded soldiers, things that I had never seen before as a journalist. And I was sure that when the American public saw them, they would turn against the war in Iraq. And Life magazine got the photos in November of 2004, and they never published them. And they held them through December and January and February. And in mid-February, I got an email from my editor, the photo editor. And she said, I hate to write you this email, but we will never publish your photos of wounded soldiers in Life magazine because my editor thinks they're too strong for the American public to see. In 2004, I started working in Darfur. I crossed, like any journalist who wanted to work in Darfur in 2004, it was impossible to get a visa at the time. We had to cross illegally, fly to Chad, which was neighboring Sudan, and walk several kilometers into Darfur and link up with the rebels. We saw burned villages, bodies littering the desert, and we spent about a week just on the back of a truck, driving through the desert, looking for bodies and anything that we can find, traces of the war. I continued covering Darfur every year for 6 years. This is from 2005. And I was with the African Union peacekeepers. And the attacks were so brazen that when we were with the peacekeepers actually approaching this village, Janjaweed, Arab men on horseback, went in and burned the village in front of the peacekeepers. And they couldn't do anything because it wasn't in their mandate to stop them. And in 2006, we heard there had been a massacre of government troops, Sudanese government troops. Many of these young men were conscripted from South Sudan and forced to fight in the north in Darfur. President Bashir denied that there had been a massacre. He said absolutely no Sudanese government soldiers were killed. And we said, well, we're with the New York Times and we want to see. So of course we couldn't get a visa to go to Sudan, so again we went to Chad and we begged a group of rebels to take us across the border. They said, look, there are Russian aircraft flying overhead and they might bomb you. We said, look, we'll take the chance, we need to see it to report it in the New York Times. And we went, and as we approached the site of the massacre, there were bodies everywhere, dozens and dozens of bodies. And I photographed this, and it was on the front page of the New York Times the next day, and President Bashir couldn't deny it. And for me, this is really the power of a photograph and the importance of documenting a situation. In 2008, I got a phone call from Dexter Filkins, who is a very well-known war correspondent in America. He had been working for the New York Times, and now he works for the New Yorker magazine. And Dexter was an old friend. We had worked together in Iraq and Afghanistan for almost a decade. And he's very funny because he talks to everyone in the same tone of voice. And he called me up and he said, hey dude, I got the best story for us. And I said, yeah, Dex. And he said, it's on the Talibanization of Pakistan. And so my husband, who was then my boyfriend at the time, just looked at me and he goes, you're not going to meet the Taliban. And I didn't say anything, I just sort of was quiet. And so Dexter went ahead and spent a month trying to get access. He hired translators, drivers, and he called me up about a month later and said, okay, I think we're ready for you to fly in. So I flew into Peshawar, I flew into Islamabad, drove to Peshawar, which is a town on the border with Afghanistan, near the tribal area. And the night before we were supposed to leave, Haji Namdar, who was the commander who had invited us in, he called and he said, you are welcome to come tomorrow morning, but the only thing you cannot do is bring a woman. So Dexter and I sort of looked at each other and said, well, we can't separate. And we turned to our translator and said, Halim, we're going together. You're going to have to figure it out. So Halim was really nervous. He said, Haji Namdar said, we can't bring a woman. How are we going to bring a woman? It's the Taliban. So we just said, I don't know, figure it out. So Halim came back and he said, I know. You are Mr. Dexter's wife, and he could never leave his wife alone in a strange city, and you must go together. So we got all dressed up, and I dressed in a shalwar kameez, and my face was fully veiled, and we drove to see Haji Namdar. We get to the commander's house, and the men go inside. I wait in the car. And shortly thereafter, they came out, and they said, okay, you are welcome to come in. I went inside, and it was a very small room, about half the size of the stage, and there were about 15 to 20 Taliban fighters in the room with their weapons and rockets and Kalashnikovs, and half of them had their prosthetic legs, everything against the wall. And I was sort of the elephant in the room, because obviously women don't enter these situations very often. And I walked in and sort of stumbled in and sat down in the room, and Dexter said, Haji Namdar, thank you for having me, and thank you for having my wife. And I sort of was looking down, and Dexter said, Haji Namdar, you know, this is my wife, and she happens to have a camera. Do you mind if she takes some photos? So he said, yeah, that's fine. So I start taking some photos, and I just thought, I can't believe he actually believes that. So I'm shooting. And about 15 minutes into it, everyone gets very fidgety. And I thought, oh shit, they're gonna kill us now. Like, we've stayed too long, you know? And so a man comes over, and he sort of comes between the people, and he comes to me and he says, Madam, we would like for you to drink a cup of tea, but we don't know how you can drink the tea through your veil. So I thought, I can't believe I'm with like some of the most vicious people on the planet, and they're stressing about how to give me a cup of tea. So they said, I know, stand in the corner of the room, face the wall, lift your veil, drink your tea, put your veil down, and you can come back. So that's how I met the Taliban. In 2009, I was assigned to photograph a story on women in Afghanistan for National Geographic magazine. And one of the issues I really wanted to cover was maternal mortality, because Afghanistan has one of the highest rates of women dying in childbirth in the world. And that's because they don't have access to medical facilities. So I spent about 10 days in the provinces photographing remote clinics, outreach workers, midwives. And on the way back, I was driving with my translator, Dr. Ziba, and we saw these two women on the side of a mountain with no man. And anyone who's worked in Afghanistan knows that all women are accompanied by a man. So we stopped the car and ran up the hill, and Dr. Ziba said, what's happening? And she said, well, Noor Nisa, the woman on the right, was in labor. And her husband's first wife died in childbirth. And he was so worried about losing his second wife to childbirth that he rented a car, which in a village in Afghanistan is a lot of money. And that car broke down. So when we found them, she was in labor on the side of the road. And so I said, come into my car, I'll drive you to the hospital. And they said, we can't, we need permission from her husband. So I turned to Ziba and I said, go find the husband. So she got in our car. There was one road that went through the whole province, and she found the husband and brought him back. And they piled in my car, and she delivered in the hospital. Stressful having this here. In 2009, I was doing a story with the medevac. Those are the teams of soldiers who go in and pick up the wounded in Afghanistan or Iraq. And we had gotten a call that there was an alpha, which is a gravely wounded soldier. So we went, and things happen very quickly. Once you get the call, you have seconds to react. Everything is through night vision goggles, which is why it's green. It's very hard to focus. This young man was put on the ground of the Black Hawk we were in, And they brought him back to the clinic, and he had lost 8 pints of blood, and for 28 minutes they tried to resuscitate him. And in that time, one of the officers came to me and said, "Stop shooting." And I looked at him and I said, "But I have permission." And I put my camera down because I didn't want to be disrespectful. And 3 other troops in the room quickly stood up and said, "No, she has to be here, let her shoot." And the young man passed away. And I have so many images that I was never able to publish, because in America you need permission from the next of kin to publish anything when someone has died, anything that shows the face or any distinguishing marks. So these are some of the very few pictures I was able to actually publish. In 2011, I went with many journalists to cover the Arab Spring in Libya. It was February of 2011, and we had to sneak into Libya through Egypt. Gaddafi did not want journalists there, and he made that very clear. He told his men, if you see Western journalists, you should kill them. They're spies, so execute them. So we knew that one of our greatest risks, aside from being on the front line, was being captured by Gaddafi's troops. This picture is as we're moving forward on the front line. It's one of the first days we pushed forward with the rebels, and they were standing on fences to see where Gaddafi's men were. And this is one of the very first days that fighting started, and these men were completely untrained. They're doctors, engineers, teachers who had picked up arms to fight against Gaddafi. And here we are on one road that cut through the desert, and a helicopter gunship came in literally above us and was spraying the ground all around us with 50 caliber bullets. And I was sort of crouching in front of a car, and I remember looking over, and these guys are shooting up into the air with guns and literally throwing rocks up at the helicopters, and I just thought, this is going to be pretty miserable. And there were airstrikes daily. Every day we heard the hum of a plane and a bomb would land next to us. You never knew where it would land. And we stayed on the front line for 2 weeks. And after 2 weeks, we were in the city of Ajdabiya, and we were covering the fighting, and it was moving closer and closer towards us, and we knew that the city would fall. And we were in a car. I was in a car with 3 colleagues for the New York Times, Tyler Hicks, Steve Farrell, and Anthony Shadid, and the fighting was coming closer and closer. But because we were 4 journalists in one car, we had very different ideas of how long we should stay. And there was a bit of some of us wanted to stay, some of us wanted to go. Meanwhile, our driver was getting calls saying, it's time to leave the city. Gaddafi's troops have entered. We finally decided to push forward, pull east. And as we started pulling east, we saw on the horizon a checkpoint. And there was the first time we had actually seen proper soldiers in uniform. And so we were approaching that checkpoint, and everyone was screaming something different. Run the checkpoint, stop, say we're journalists. And our driver panicked, and right about where you see the name Brian Denton, our driver stopped the car and jumped out and said, we're journalists. And very quickly, Gaddafi's men pulled us out of the car, and the rebels that we had been photographing started opening fire on that checkpoint, and we were caught completely in a wall of bullets. We each made a run for it and ended up behind that cement building, which you see on the right. We were told to lie face down on the ground, and they put their guns to our head. Each one of us had a gun to our heads, and they were about to execute us. And Anthony Shadid, who spoke Arabic, was able to translate for us after the fact. We pleaded for our lives, and eventually they decided not to kill us, and they took my shoes off. And I remember feeling the air on my feet, and they took the laces out of my shoes and started tying me up, my hands and feet together, and carried me off. They placed the 4 of us in vehicles in the middle of the front line and watched for hours as we were helpless, tied up on the front line as bombs and bullets rained around us. We were beaten, tied up, and threatened with death over the course of the first 4 days. And eventually we were flown to Tripoli, and people negotiated for our release. We were released on the 21st of March, about a week later. 2 weeks after that, my colleague Brian Denton for the New York Times went back to the site. Our driver was never found. We think he was killed in that moment. He went back to help Mohammed's family look for his body or see if he was in prison, and he found my shoe on the side of the road that was still there without the laces. That's it.